Good afternoon, everybody, and I'm really happy to have you all here, and that we will have this exciting webinar with our for ClairCity. It's our third webinar, so we're slowly getting used to this new platform, and I hope that that will show off during the presentations and the Q&A. We are in this last webinar from the first three that we had planned. There will be more details coming, but in this last webinar, we will concentrating on the citizens and their role in policy making. And that is what we're going to talk about. We are very happy to have from the European Commission, Lucia Bernal, who will tell us more about the current state of affairs from the European Commission on air quality. From there on, we will have presentations of Enda Hayes from the UE Bristol, who will introduce the project to you in more detail. Then Stephan Slingerland and Irati Artola will talk about the policy development and how we did that within the project. And the last bit of the program is the case of Bristol and how ClairCity worked with the city and lessons learned and what went great and what went good. And Andrew Edwards is with us to talk for Bristol. So that is there will be, after each part, there will be time for questions, and you can have put all your questions in the chat box. Then I will give them back to the presenters, and that way we will have an interactive dialogue. But we cannot do that during the presentations. That is often too complicated in a webinar. So we will do that next to after the presentations. I hope that that is all clear, and that you can see on your screen the agenda and roughly the time that we expect to spend on everything. So bear with us, listen, be critical, ask your questions, and I hope that will be an interesting meeting. Let me start immediately with the European Commission. And as I said already, we're very happy to have you here, and please take the floor and tell us what's going on within the EU and the clean air policy.
So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, first of all, to the organizers of this webinar for the kind invitation to provide me with an update of EU clean air policy. During today's presentation, I will first talk about the overall policy framework, then the results of the fitness check and the European Green Deal, future next steps, and the National Emission Reduction Commitments Directive, as well as links between air quality and climate change. So to start, well, in order to combat air pollution in the European Union over the past 2 decades, a three-pillar approach has been developed and put in practice. The first pillar on the top of the slide are the Ambient Air Quality Directive, which focus on achieving safe concentration levels for 13 air pollutants in ambient air. This directive set common methods and criteria to assess air quality in all member states, who have to designate zones and agglomerations throughout their territory, classifying them according to prescribed assessment thresholds and provide air quality assessments. The directives also require that when air quality standards are not met, member states have to prepare and implement air quality plans and measures. However, concentration levels, as we know, largely depend on emissions from various sources. This is why under the second pillar, we have the National Emission Reduction Commitments Directive, which sets targets on emission reductions at national level for the most important transboundary pollutants. And third, we have a specific emission standards on large combustion plants, on medium combustion plants, boilers, and other heating devices, and of course for cars and fuels. So overall, this framework works, and it has delivered substantial improvements in air quality in Europe over the past decades. But we know that there's still scope for doing more and better. So last year, at the end of last year, we concluded an evaluation of the two ambient air quality directives called the fitness check. It provides a big evidence-based retrospective analysis of whether the European Union actions are fit for purpose. It was a 2-year-long in-depth assessment covering a number of actions, which are listed in the slide, and which cover, for example, literature review, air quality data assessment from the past 10 years, open public consultation, targeted questionnaires, elaboration of case studies in 7 member states. And based on this analysis, we concluded that air quality policy in principle works. Let me now summarize the 4 main findings of this fitness check. On monitoring, well, across the European Union, we have more than 4,000 monitoring stations based on the common criteria defined in the directives. And this extensive network can be considered a success in itself. However, in some cases, it can also still be improved. On air quality standards, we have established, as I said before, 13 standards for, air quality standards for 13 air pollutants. And these have been instrumental in reducing and exceedance levels. However, these standards are not fully aligned with the air quality guidelines of the World Health Organization. Thirdly, the directives have facilitated the availability and accessibility of the objective and comparable air quality information provided by the member states. However, there is still scope for accelerating this reporting. And finally, the clear requirement in the directive to take action when there are exceedances has been key in triggering improvement in air quality. However, here the directives have only been partially successful, as there's still 20 member states still today report exceedances above European Union limits for at least one pollutant and often for several. So while we have seen improvements in air quality, there's still scope to improve, and this is why we concluded that the directives are broadly fit for purpose. So indeed, air pollution remains a health challenge, and in this slide on the left, we can see the EU population that is exposed in cities to air pollution levels above the EU standards. And on the right, we see that same population exposure but to WHO standards. So here, comparison with WHO, the situation worsens considerably, especially for PM2.5 and ozone. And where do we see problems? Well, concerning these two pollutants, PM10 and NO2, exceedances, PM10 is mostly linked with fuel combustion, so heating and transport. And here we have certain hotspots in Europe, especially Bulgaria, Poland, and northern of Italy, as well as in some other places such as Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, France, also in Spain. On the right, we see the NO2 exceedances that are often traffic. And here we see that in most of European citizens, there is a problem. So more than 130 cities are showing exceedance in NO2 annual limit values. So with this information, the fitness check also pointed to 7 key lessons learned to inform future action on air quality policy. First of all, air quality remains a major health and environmental concern, and the standards have been only partially effective to reduce pollution. The current standards, as we have just seen, are less ambitious than scientific evidence, but limit values have been effective more than other types of standards that are included in the direct target values, which is the case for some of the pollutants. We have seen also that legal enforcement action taken by the European Commission or by civil society works in improving the implementation of the directives. And there's actually a scope to harmonize monitoring, modeling, and air quality plans, where some provisions lack some clarity. E-reporting also allows for further efficiency, even if reporting has been very much improved also in the last years. So what's next? As announced in the communication of the European Green Deal, the Commission will draw on the lessons learned from this fitness check. The Commission is also proposing to strengthen provisions on monitoring, modeling, and air quality plans to help local authorities achieve cleaner air. We will also propose to revise the air quality standards to align them more closely to the WHO recommendations, which are actually currently being updated. And the Commission will put forward a zero pollution action plan on air, water, and soil in 2021. Regarding the strengthening of the provisions on monitoring, modeling, and air quality plans, this is one of the scope of further action, and here stakeholders, local, regional, national authorities pointed during the fitness check to a number of issues under these three topics that could be that would benefit from further guidance or clarity in the provisions in the directive. To mention some of those, we have, for example, we need more clarity on the seating of the sampling points, so where the monitoring stations are placed, the role of modeling in air quality assessment, and also further clarifications on the minimum elements for air quality plans, how the coordination between different levels of governance is done, and assessment of costs and benefits of the measures to improve air quality, just as an example. We are also taking further action in other actions to implementation of this legislation. We continue enforcement where we see that persistent exceedances of limit values are happening. There we start infringement action, and currently we have 31 cases addressing 17 member states on the PM10, NO2, and SO2 exceedances, as well as for monitoring gaps. Funding has also been available for air quality measures, and in the last financing period, this amounted to almost 2 billion euros under the European Structural and Investment Funds. To this, we can also add funds coming from, for example, Horizon 2020, as the project being presented today, or LIFE projects, etc. We also have other means, such as dialogue, and here we work with different networks on monitoring, on modeling, and also to these quality measures. We hold cleaner dialogues with member states to help facilitate full implementation of the legislation. And we also place particular emphasis on bringing together member states, regions, and cities, for example, via the EU Urban Agenda or Urban Innovative Actions. Now, I wanted to shortly also mention the reduction commitments directive. This, as I said at the beginning of the presentation, sets targets for emission reductions at national level for the most important transboundary pollutants. And it also requires all member states to prepare national air pollution control programs, those that had to be adopted by 1st April 2019. And activities concerning this directive are the NEC implementation report, which will be published soon, and where the Commission has analyzed member states' obligations, in particular how they are achieving this emission reduction. There will be an assessment of the national air pollution control programs. The Commission is monitoring also ecosystem impacts of air pollution and revising the emission inventories and projections. And on the fourth quarter of 2020, the Commission will issue the second Cleaner Outlook, which reports on the clean air situation and will analyze how NEC commitments can be best reached. And to finalize, this leads me to how also air links with climate policies. So it is our view that these are obviously closely linked by a number of synergies, for example, by taking measures on building renovation or promoting the use of electric vehicles. We can achieve success in both policies, but there's also a risk of trade-offs, like, for example, by the use of bioenergy in domestic heating can emit more particles than other renewable energies. So we have made this link with the legislation through cross-reference in Energy Union governance and through the NEC directive that we just seen, to use inputs from each other. And the national energy and climate plans have included recommendations from the Commission that refer to the lack of analysis of air impacts 26 member states. So both the national energy and climate plans and the national air pollution control programs have been looked at with the focus on air and climate policies, trying to make links between those two. Because it is our view that taking air co-benefits into account in climate policy reduces the social cost of these measures needed, and they should always be going hand in hand. So with this, I have finished my presentation. I hope it was not too quick. I wanted to present a lot, but I hope it was understanding enough. And I've seen there's a number of questions, so I'm happy now to take questions, to be able to answer them. And if not, I hope I can send the written replies if I wouldn't have the information now. Thanks.
Thank you very, very much. That was indeed a very good overview of where we stand with air quality and the European Commission. As former Director of Air Quality in the Netherlands, I can confirm this evaluation. I think the European air quality directives have had a tremendous impact. I think they have been very, very instrumental in bringing air quality forward in all their aspects, all the set of instruments together. So I really think that EU has played a key role here. Nevertheless, we do get quite some questions in here for you. And I have to tell the audience that she will be with us for quite a while, but not until the very end. So Lucia has to leave before the last Q&A. So any questions to her have to come now. I'm going to pick on what I think are really good and interesting questions. I will try to combine sometimes. There are a few questions that are about the monitoring network. And does the monitoring network guidance is explicitly enough and to be really ensure the public health impact? The possibilities that you really can benefit from greatest public health depending on the location where you measure. Is there anything coming in that respect in the new directive?
Well, first of all, it will not be a new directive. That's what we aim to do. Yeah, what we aim to do is to clarify certain provisions regarding monitoring, modeling, and air quality plans. So it will stay the same directive. Just clarity, modifying certain provisions, or also providing guidance. So of course, our biggest goal here is to protect European citizens' health, and we will be looking at the ways that member states have been monitoring, and indeed if they have been able to monitor and report on as per the directive. So we will be looking at the different ways that monitoring has been occurring.
Okay, thank you. And then there is a group of questions on the way the Commission is dealing with infringements, and whether that is directed at the polluter or more at the national or local government, whether what will happen with the UK in this when they leave the EU. And there was a question on monitoring. Let me check quickly. No, those were the two on monitoring. So could you say something on that?
Yes, so enforcement action is directed to member states authorities, because those are the ones that are the ones that have to ensure implementation of European law, European directives. Those are our interlocutors. Then on the UK, unfortunately, I don't know still the information coming from the negotiations on the UK. So here I'm really sorry. I will refrain from making any statements that could be wrong.
Okay, I think that's on the safe side, and you're right. And there is another question on this infringements, and that's the question from whether dialogue with transgressors is working better than censure and punishment. So
what is meant? Sorry.
The question is, can you better dialogue with people that are not okay, with countries or regions that are breaking the limits, or is it better to start a dialogue, or should the Commission be more strict and talk about censure and punishment? I think it's a question.
I think our view is that it's complementary. So we are taking action in the implementation, first of all, on setting dialogue with member states. As mentioned, we hold cleaner dialogues with member states that request this to us, where we discuss different implementation issues. But then, of course, if we see that exceedances persist and that not sufficient action is taken, we start infringement cases. So I would say it's a combination of both, and it has proven to be effective. But as said before, more can be done, and this is why we think that also implementation at the same time is important, and this is why we are going to clarify certain provisions and provide further guidance for member states and all the authorities that are responsible for implementing air quality at European territory, so that they can improve implementation and we don't have to go until the last steps of enforcement. That is not the aim. So the aim is to achieve cleaner air, and always the best means is by improving implementation.
Okay, given the time, I cannot ask all the questions. There's much more, but we will do that online later on. I will combine one more last set of questions. That is, people make positive comments on combining air quality and climate, which our project was all about as well. So people are very happy about that, and they ask what that means. And then many people refer to your comment on the WHO, and they ask, are you really going to the WHO standards? And I could rephrase that, is there enough political support in member states to go that far?
Yes, for the time being, we don't have clarity on this WHO standard, so we are still waiting for their publication to come out at the end of the year, and we will see how that looks like.
Okay. Thank you very much also for all the answers. Please, everybody, if I couldn't pick up your question, it's because there were many questions. We will try offline to answer as much as possible of your questions. And Lucia, thank you very much again. We move quickly on to our next speaker. And our next speaker, oh, sorry, that was the Q&A that I should have been putting up. Our next speaker is Enda Hayes, who has been the technical director of the project, who will give you a short overview of the ClairCity project. Enda, over to you.
Thank you, Hans. So very quickly, what I'm going to do is give you a quick overview of the ClairCity project, a quick overview of the concept behind it, and also the ClairCity process itself, so you understand where the policy elements fit into the wider process of engaging citizens in the quantification work, so that the slides from Irati and Stephan will hopefully make a little bit more sense for you. So the ClairCity project, 4 years Horizon 2020 funded project, was really around this idea of looking at how people's day-to-day practices and activities and behaviors generated air pollution or carbon emissions. And we wanted to understand what were the factors that were influencing those behaviors. What were the factors that resulted in people perhaps feeling entrenched in a certain pattern or behavior, or what were the enabling factors which were allowing people to make greener choices in terms of how they move or in terms of their domestic heating and cooking. So the concept, which we applied in 6 cities and regions, Bristol in the UK, Amsterdam in the Netherlands, Sosnowiec in Poland, the Liguria region of Italy, the Avaro region of Portugal, and Ljubljana in Slovenia, was to explore this idea of moving the conversation forward from the where and the what to the who and the why. And what we mean by that is, if we think about the way we traditionally talk about air quality and consider air quality management, is we tend to be focused on very much on the sources of air pollution or carbon emissions. So this could be transport, this could be cars, buses, HGVs, this could be different fuel types being used in the home. And we're also very focused on the geographical location of these pollution problems. So these hotspots where we've got major events. Now, that works fine from a policy and a management perspective, but when you want to engage the public, we felt that this was a very technocentric conversation. So what we tried to do in ClairCity was to move it towards a who and a what, and to better understand the different demographics that are generating air pollution, whether it's different genders, whether it's different age groups, whether it's different income categories, and also the motives behind why people do what they do. So this is kind of some of the data we started to generate. On the left is a graphic that's come from Bristol City Council, where we've seen a breakdown of NOx emissions by different vehicle types or different fuel types. So if we think about the way we apportion pollution, it tends to be very cars, buses, HGVs, different Euro standards, different fuel types. What ClairCity wanted to try and do was to break it down by different motives. So looking at the breakdown in terms of leisure time, commuting to work, business time, shopping, all those reasons that I, as a driver, might get behind the wheel of the car. And it is shifting the conversation to be much more people orientated rather than just technology orientated. Now, what we wanted to do with the data that we generated was also to marry it with qualitative evidence to provide context. And what we have found is that we started to understand better why people felt that they had to use their car. As we see, unfortunately, I use my car. And what we saw was evidence like things like heavy loads, steep hill, small children, I use my car. Accessibility being a major issue, cost of public transport being an issue, the need for flexibility. And it was all these barriers that resulted in people feeling entrenched in a certain pattern of behavior. So once we had this evidence and once we had that conversation with people, we were then able to have a very different conversation in terms of, okay, this is why you act the way you do. What enabling mechanisms can we put in place to try and make greener choices the social norm for everybody going forward? So the ClairCity aim through this data was to try and create a shift in the public understanding towards the causes of air quality, to give the public a better sense of ownership of the air pollution and carbon emissions problem by having a conversation that they can relate to. It's a conversation regarding their own behaviors, but also then to give them a voice and give that form in terms of generating opinions and generating ideas and policies for what their future cities might look like. And in this particular webinar, we're going to focus primarily on how we put citizens into that policy development process. And if you want to learn more about the public engagement activities or indeed the modeling activities that we did, then please look at the recordings of the last 2 webinars that we've done over the last couple of weeks. So this is the ClairCity process. It was a 3-phase process that we implemented in all of our cities and regions to try and understand the scientific robustness of what we were doing, but also the flexibility within our system. So phase 1 was around benchmarking and establishing a baseline. Phase 2 was around engagement with the stakeholders and the co-creation process of scenarios. And stage 4 was around the impact assessment of those scenarios and developing various different policy packages. So if we zoom in on that process, the first step was really about benchmarking the behavior and the source apportionment of emissions by different motives, where we had suitable data available. We found that in some cities we could do it, in other cities we couldn't. We quantified the baselines in terms of air quality and carbon emissions across our different cities, and indeed the public health impacts. And we also did a benchmark in terms of policy so that we understood the landscape that people were coming from. We then used that evidence to go into stage 2, where we ran a number of different public engagement activities. We had Skylines games and apps, we had city events, we had workshops, we had filming activities, we had surveys, different engagement processes for different audiences, because we understood that the public is not just one Borg entity that think the same, act the same, move the same. What will be needed for a young person will be very, very different from a retired couple, etc. So this is why we had so many different engagement platforms. And if you look at our first webinar, you can learn a lot more about those there. We then started to try and work towards consensus. Now, what we're trying to do here is look at the evidence that was generated through our survey, through our workshops, through our games and apps, and bring that evidence together to try and find points of consensus in terms of how people might want to live and act and interact with their cities in the future, and also look at what the public attitudes and public perceptions of different policies. We took those consensus points through various different stakeholder dialogue workshops and into policy workshops, where we were able to create a unified policy scenario, which came from the citizens' voice, but had an element of policy sense check in terms of understanding the level of ambition we wanted to apply to different policies, the timelines for these different policies. That unified policy scenario then went back into our quantification chain so that we can quantify it in terms of changes in motivation, changes in emissions, in concentrations, and in health. And all that evidence then came together in a policy package. So that was the process. That's how it all came together. And Stephan and Irati will now talk you much more detail about that process of bringing citizens into the policy making sphere and ensuring that their voice is heard from the bottom up.
Thank you very much, Enda, for giving a clear overview where we stand in the project. And now over to Stephan and Irati, who will tell us how we dealt with this citizens' input towards policy making. Stephan, Irati, over to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Hans. I will give a short introduction, then Irati will take over, and I'll end with a couple of conclusions. Good afternoon, everybody. I think we got definitely some very interesting policy lessons to show to you from 4 years of ClairCity research, and I'd like to show them. Yes, it works. Yeah, what he did was actually to develop a completely new method of policy making that includes citizens in city air quality and carbon policy making. So I want to show you briefly the 6 steps that we developed throughout the process. What we did was first to develop some policy baselines, looking into the existing situations in all the 6 cities. Then we had citizen engagement activities, where we looked particularly into what practices people do right now, actually, what they want to do in the future, and what kind of future they envisage for their city. Then we had the citizen scenarios that were created, discussed with policymakers in policy workshops, where policymakers on one hand could say, well, this can be realized, and this is perhaps a bit more difficult. But also we asked policymakers to provide enabling factors so that the wishes of citizens could be realized. We modeled the co-created scenarios by looking into the emissions, the concentrations, the health impacts, and the costs of the scenarios. Then we had a stage in which we did the mutual learning. We looked into all the cities and looked into kind of enabling factors that we could find for citizen inclusive policies in all the cities. And finally, based on that, we provided each city with a city action plan and detailed, tailored policy recommendations. So what is new in this process? I think, well, Enda already said it a little bit, but what is definitely new is the various kind of citizen engagement activities that we provided throughout the process, which you could also already look into in the first webinar that we had. New is also the way we modeled the scenarios, and that was talked about in the second webinar. But I think what is also new here is that we kind of had a separate stage of citizen engagement and a policymaker check in order to provide scenarios that are both ambitious as well as have some basis in the reality of policymaking. And above all, I think what is new is that we provided for a 6-stage, very detailed process that's both qualitative and quantitative, and that gives a very good basis for citizen inclusive policymaking. Now, what we produced were a lot of reports in the first place, where you can find in detail all our results. We spoke with key policymakers and stakeholders in all the 6 cities. We had some 82 policymakers involved in the policy workshops, and all that you can find back on our ClairCity website under the reports section. So that's for a brief introduction. Now over to Irati for some more detailed results.
Yes, thank you, Stephan, and good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to take you through the steps of the process that Stephan just explained to present the results and findings that we achieved. And the first step in the method was the policy baseline analysis of the 6 case study cities, for which we looked at the air quality and climate situation in each of the cities at present. We looked also at the citizen engagement activities that were ongoing in these cities, and also at the existing air quality and carbon policies in these cities. Now, we already knew when we started ClairCity that these cities were very different from each other. That's the reason why we chose them, actually, and that the air quality situation, the main problem pollutants, and the sources of these pollutants varied substantially from city to city. So while in Genoa or in Bristol, nitrogen dioxide caused by road traffic was the main source of pollution and pollutants. In other cities, such as Sosnowiec and Ljubljana, particulate matter and domestic heating was much more of a problem. Now, what we found in common for all these cities from a policy point of view is that in all cities, policymakers had green ambitions to reduce air pollution and carbon emissions to some extent. And we also interestingly found that cities have the power to go beyond national requirements and implement more ambitious policies than what central government or the state requires them to. So as an example, in Ljubljana, which has pedestrianized its entire city center, there's even more ambitions to continue expanding that car-free area. And another example is Amsterdam, which is aiming to be gas-free by 2040, whereas the Netherlands is aiming to achieve that only a decade later by 2050. But probably what for us was the most refreshing conclusion is that despite these differences between cities, the policy framework for air quality and carbon policies is pretty much the same across all 6 cities. One, when it comes to transport, all cities are pushing for modal shift away from private cars towards much more public transport and active travel, such as cycling or walking. And 2, the cities are pushing for energy efficiency and fuel shift towards much more renewables and district heating. And this was actually a very important finding for us, because it means that a ClairCity method can be replicated to other cities in the EU, but also probably overseas. And the next step in the process was engaging citizens. And we did that by asking citizens about their present as well as future behavior regarding transport and domestic heating. Now, through this slide, I'd like to show what we did by using the example of one of our case study cities, namely the Aveiro region in Portugal. And since we can't present the results for all cities, we just picked this one. And this graph shows how citizens commute to work currently, here on the left-hand side, and in the future. Now, what we see is that there's huge willingness to switch from conventional cars towards public transport and active travel. Another thing that we see in this chart is that among the conventional car drivers who would like to continue driving their car in the future, there's quite some fraction of those that would like to do that in a cleaner car, such as a hybrid or an electric car. Well, we did this exercise not just for commuting, but we also did it for other practices such as shopping and leisure or recreation. And although we can't go into the details of the results of these, our findings and results were very, very similar, showing that there is quite some people that are looking for positive change across all these cities, away from unsustainable practices of traveling towards much more sustainable ones. And these are the target group we really want to understand. And the evident question right now would be, what is stopping them from making the change? Now, Enda already showed some speech bubbles, which with quotes we got throughout the project. And let's take this one on the top, for instance. The prices of public transport are high. It's cheaper to travel by car than to buy a bus pass. Or this other one below, public transport is like there are no connections or schedules compatible with my needs. Now, the bottom line is that citizens experience that they are faced with barriers that make it difficult for them to change their behavior. Now, thanks to having carried out this exercise for all 6 cities of ClairCity, what we have learned is for each city, which activities citizens would be more willing to change for, whether that's commuting, shopping, or leisure, and which activities they would not be so keen in changing for. And this is actually really informative for policy making in cities, as it allows city policymakers to design interventions that are targeted to the city and can make a difference. We did a similar exercise for heating, with surveying citizens and asking them both about their present as well as future desired behavior. And we see here that what stands out is that there's a huge appetite for renewables in the future, actually across all cities. And what we learned is that what's stopping citizens from taking action are mainly costs and lack of subsidies, and also the fact that citizens are often not homeowners, but tenants in their homes. And they feel powerless to make any changes or not motivated enough in any case. Another thing that this graph shows us is that, probably you cannot see it very well, but is that district heating in the future, the demand for it is actually decreasing everywhere in all 6 case study cities. Now, we were surprised to find that, one, because district heating can be a very environmental friendly option when powered by renewables, but also because virtually every city in ClairCity is working to further develop their networks or to develop a district heating network in their cities. So we Either we can think that this is because citizens indeed don't want district heating, or this may be actually prompted by the fact that citizens don't know how district heating works, when and why it can be a sustainable option, etc., etc. So we may have identified lack of awareness situation here. The main policy conclusion we drew from this exercise was that sometimes there's a mismatch between what citizens want and what policymakers want for the city. And this is not necessarily bad. It just suggests that policymakers will have to explore either how to support citizens better, for instance, in the case of renewables, for which we saw there's a huge appetite, or policymakers, they may want to consider awareness-raising campaigns to justify the direction that they themselves are trying to go into or pushing forward in their city, for instance, in the case of district heating. And another thing we asked citizens across all 6 cities was the types of policies that they would like to see implemented in their cities in the areas of transport and heating. And this slide is a snapshot of what we got, which boils down to the fact that across all cities, citizens wanted better public transport and cheaper and cleaner public transport. Citizens were also pushing for car-related measures, such as limiting car parking, encouraging e-mobility, or city centers that are car-free. Citizens also across all cities wanted to see measures implemented regarding active travel, such as more cycling infrastructure and more space for pedestrians. And citizens, lastly, wanted energy-related measures, such as help to increase the number of solar panels in the city, and also subsidies to replace domestic heating systems. Now, these measures are not surprising for city policymakers, and all cities in Europe pretty much are implementing some or a few of these. Oh, sorry. Yes, what's interesting here is that unlike what we thought when we started ClairCity, citizens are not extremely innovative in what they want for the future. They don't necessarily come up with very futuristic policies, but when asked instead, they just come up with very similar policies to what policymakers already are implementing in the cities. The main difference is that when we go into the details of these policies I just mentioned, such as better public transport or more cycling infrastructure, citizens tend to be quite or a lot more ambitious than policymakers, wanting faster implementation and higher ambition levels of these policies. It's also interesting that we found, and it's not in this blue banner, but it's interesting for the rest of the slides that we are going to present and the conclusions that we are going to make, is that citizens often came up with policies that seem pretty infeasible. Just to give an example, many citizens wanted more frequent, better, cleaner, wider range public transport, and at the same time were requiring public transport to be free. Well, this is obviously very challenging from a policy point of view, and the takeaway from this exercise for us was that empowering and listening to citizens is just one part of the story, but that making good policies requires more thought than that and making compromises. And this takes me to the next step in the process, which was the policymakers check, consisting of policy workshops that we run across all of the 6 cities with the aim to discuss together with policymakers, councillors, politicians, but also policy officers across different departments in halls, and to discuss policy measures with them around heating and transport, so that they would tell us if the preferred policies of citizens were realistic in their views, and also how they could make, how they could see those policies being implemented, what the enabling factors would be, and what the hindrances would be to implement the policies envisioned by citizens. The results across all policy workshops and the discussions were very different, but we were able to draw a few conclusions. The first one being that some cities restrict ambitions of citizens more than others. And what we mean by that is that in some cities, policymakers' ideas were a lot more aligned with citizens' wishes than in others, where city policymakers considered that the timeframes or the ambitions of citizens were not feasible or inappropriate. Obviously, costs were an important factor for policymakers, and often the primary reason why policymakers would not support the ambition level or the timeframe proposed by citizens. And to illustrate this, policymakers in none of the 6 cities supported cheaper or free public transport, as this would go together with improving public transport and greening it, which was very popular across all cities. We also found that changing behavior of citizens is seen as a big challenge in all of the cities, actually. And therefore, everywhere awareness raising was seen as key, particularly when it comes to pushing forward measures that require change in citizens' behavior, but also as awareness raising to motivate us to take action. A particularly sensitive issue was around private car use, where all cities were doing something about, but in some of the cities, policymakers were very cautious on how far they would go not to upset citizens. So in the most ambitious cities, such as in Amsterdam or in Ljubljana, we would see that policymakers were very supportive of or partly supportive of closing parts of the city to private cars or raising parking fees, whereas in other cities of ClairCity, that was really not the case. And so we took the policy measures proposed by citizens on one hand, and we had them discussed at policy workshops by policymakers on the other hand, so that the output was a co-created scenario for each city of citizens' preferred measures which have undergone this policymakers check. And because of this check step, the ambition of the co-created scenarios will depend largely on the extent to which policymakers in a city agree with citizens' measures. And one may think that this step could somehow mute citizens' preferences, but what ClairCity actually saw is that this step instead, what it allows is for co-created scenarios to be both realistic as well as ambitious, as Stephan explained at the start of the presentation. Now, we took this co-created scenario and the next step was to quantify it. So we looked at the effects that these measures in these co-created scenarios would, co-created scenario would have in terms of emissions, concentrations, health, and cost. And of course, our assumption was that the co-created scenario would lead to many more positive impacts in this regard than continuing business as usual, which is what we compare this co-created scenario with. And this slide shows that comparison between the effects generated by the co-created scenario and the business as usual. And what we see is that both in Amsterdam and in Bristol, the co-created scenarios are going to lead to the highest health impacts in comparison to the business as usual, meaning that the co-created scenario in these cities will lead to higher reduction of the pollutants we see here, as well as carbon dioxide emissions. And this is to a large extent due to the fact that citizens' ambitions in these cities were the least restricted by policymakers in these two cities. While in the other cities, policymakers brought down the ambition level of citizens a little more. However, what we see in general is that the co-created scenarios led overall to better effects than in the business as usual. And this means that, or we can conclude from this, that listening to citizens increases the health and climate impacts of policies, which confirms that the ClairCity method works. And the difficulty lies in finding the right balance, as I said before, between the ambition measures and costs and implementation feasibility issues that that policies may lead to. And I'll pass on the floor to Stephan.
Yeah, thanks, Irati, for the final part. I'll tell you a bit more about the mutual learning, which we looked into the different cities to see what kind of enabling factors we could find for citizen inclusive policy making in all of the cities. And you can order these different policies that we found on a engagement letter. Here it's the so-called Neufeld engagement letter. Looking at the bottom is starting with just simply monitoring the current situation. I think the ClairCity policy framework that we provided is an example of a very detailed and also useful way of monitoring the situation before you start, because that's the basis of all policy making with or without citizens. Looking into providing information, informing and educating people, well, we found examples like in Sosnowiec, the information panels for public transport, where also air quality information was provided. We found in the Aveiro region, we found the pupil workshops on biking. We found factors enabling people to change their behaviors, like here in Amsterdam, huge bike shelters at the station, whereby people could switch from active transport, so that's biking, to the train and vice versa. We found factors like changing the default, like here in the city center of Ljubljana, where the default became walking by creating a huge pedestrian zone in the city center. We found factors that were guiding choice through incentives and disincentives, like the clean air zone to be made in Bristol. And we found factors like restricting choice, like in Genoa, the ambition to restrict access for polluting Vespas to the city center. So all these factors we took into account when providing the final policy recommendations and making the city action plans for each of the cities. And we don't have the time, unfortunately, to go through all the cities with their tailored action plans. But what I'd like to give to you is 3 main lessons that we learned from this policy method. One is that we think that the ClairCity method can help to improve policy design by tailoring policies to specific behavioral practices, like in Bristol, the leisure and shopping behavior, and it can help to identify barriers and enabling factors for change, like the factors that I showed to you. It can also help to foster dialogue with citizens by identifying gaps between the planned policies and the citizens' willingness to change behaviors, like the case that Irati explained on the district heating, where that could be an indication that awareness campaigns could be an idea to consider for policymakers. And finally, we think that ClairCity can help to create supported and implementable policies by, on one hand, giving a view on citizens' ideas, and on the other hand, providing a kind of reality check of these ideas by policymakers, so that in the end, supported and implementable policies do result. So that's why we think that in the end, with this policy method that we all created in 4 years of research, I think that ClairCity can definitely contribute to successful and ambitious air quality and carbon policy making in cities together with citizens. And if you want to have a look into more information on this, you can have a look at the website takeaction/policymakers. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much as well, Stephan and Irati. I think it's always difficult in a short time to present all the findings we had, but it gave a good flavor of how we approached it, how we did it, and some very nice results. There are a lot of questions coming in, but we will take them after also the presentation of Andy. I think then we have the full flavor of everything that is being done. And Andy Edwards, who works for the Bristol City Council, will give us a flavor how it was to work on the other side in the city and to work with this a little bit new and different approach. And I'm curious to hear, Andy, what you have to say about the ClairCity project and the ClairCity approach. Over to you.
Thank you, Hans, and yeah, thanks for the opportunity to sort of put Bristol City Council's and my view of the project forward in this discussion. The first thing to say is it's already been described, that process, but the engagement process was a very sort of innovative and interesting methodology that was used. And what that allowed us to do through the project was to engage a really wide range of communities in the city, and a wide range of kind of understandings of the air quality issues, the emissions and health impacts and solutions. So you had some groups that we were engaging with were quite unaware of those issues. So it's an opportunity to engage with them and get them talking about the problems, but also through the process we engage those that were already aware of the problems. And what we found sometimes is that groups have a particular focus, maybe a particular area of the city, a particular pollutant, a particular source of pollution which they have a concern about, and through this process it was useful to be able to put the air quality issues that they had a particular focus on in some context, in a citywide context, to look at the wider problems and solutions. So that was all really helpful for Bristol City Council, but also it engaged public with policymakers and city leaders at the same time as well. So what that helped to do was bring into focus the areas of air quality and climate change into policymakers, officers within the council, to ensure that they had a really firm understanding of how they may help and influence those issues through their everyday areas of work, and also engaging those the city leaders, and politicians in this. And I think what was really useful from our perspective is the way that the ClairCity project was able to take those policies chosen by the citizens and actually model those impacts. And I think that's what's quite difficult to do sometimes, and quite an intensive thing to do in terms of resource. And so to have that material to present to policymakers to illustrate the impacts that some of those things could have on air quality and climate change in our city was incredibly useful. And to talk about the influence of the project, it's worth saying, I think it's very difficult to try and quantify the impact that this project has had. It's very hard to measure those changes it may have brought about, but here's just a few of my thoughts and observations, I suppose, on where I think it has made a difference and has had an influence. So what it did was brought together the citizen-led policy ideas with the policymakers, politicians and city leaders. So the engagement identified the policy supported by the citizens of Bristol, but what it also did was useful, I think, was to show the scale of ambition for those policies from the citizens. And I think, from my personal perspective, is actually quite. It was good to see that strong level of ambition that was shown from the citizens through this process. The other area which I think was, I think, surprising to some people, but not to others. But I think where the project linked pollution and carbon emissions to behaviour, I think within the world of air quality traffic management, quite often the focus is on those peak hours of congestion and those peak hours of pollution, which we see in our monitors every day, and we see on the congested every day. But when you dig deeper into what the impacts on air pollution over the year is, so the air quality objectives which we are working towards for nitrogen dioxide, where we have exceedances of the EU limit values and UK objectives, that's focused on an annual value for nitrogen dioxide. So when you're looking at the long-term emissions, it becomes quite clear from the work done on ClairCity that you need to look at things like leisure travel. So whilst commuting is still very significant, if your policies don't tackle those other reasons for people to travel and reasons for people to create emissions, then we maybe aren't being as we could be. So that's been very good to see and to be able to quantify. And the outputs have helped us with our policy development within the city. So we have the policy package, which has been described, and the measures that are supported by citizens. And as an example of that, during the course of the 4-year project, Bristol City Council developed the Bristol Transport Strategy, looking to identify, to improve sustainable transport in the city as one of the main focuses. And what we were able to do with the findings of the ClairCity project was to actually demonstrate that the citizens who'd been engaged, the wide, I think it's fair to say, wide engagement of citizens in the city supported those measures within the Bristol Transport Strategy. So what we did actually was submit a formal consultation response on behalf of the project. We also had some opportunities for press releases, so some of those interesting findings. And when we've done that, we had the support or the quotes from the Mayor's office on those press releases, which I think is also sort of a very useful way of engaging those sort of city leaders in the process. And I think I didn't mention it on the first slide, but yeah, we had the Mayor of Bristol at the launch of the ClairCity game. So that was probably a couple of years now. So they've been involved in it and aware of the project and its aims and outputs from a very early stage, which is good. I'd just like to maybe finish over the 4 years of this project. Actually, policy in Bristol has developed quite significantly in terms of air pollution and climate emission reductions. So we've had development of clean air zone plans, which are still ongoing. As I mentioned before, the Bristol Transport Strategy that has been published. That was published last year. But as these other policies, obviously these are other policies that are being developed at the moment, which could potentially have impact on air quality and climate change. And I think for me, I'll finish on the point that it's really useful that we have these policies in a policy package that shows that the citizens have supported these, and they have supported these with high levels of ambition, and the policy sort of makers within the city council are aware of those and aware of that level of ambition. And so I think that's just going to be a useful thing as we move forward, trying to sort of reduce air pollution and reduce carbon emissions over the next 10, 15, 20 years. So yeah, that's all I'd like to say. So yeah, hand back to Hans to I think maybe field some questions. Is that right?
That is absolutely correct. Thank you, Andy. Thanks for the fair and open response to the question, what did ClairCity mean to you? It's not always just easy. There's always some, it's such a long project where you work so intensively together, but I think you gave a very good indication of where we stand. We are going now to the questions. And let me start, that we've got some very more content-oriented one. But let me start with a very opportunistic one for us, but I think it's relevant. Someone's saying this is a nice method. What are the costs if I want to implement this in any other city? Do we have an estimate for that, Stephan, on the cost of implementing this in a medium-sized European city?
Yeah, thank you, Hans. It's of course a very relevant question, because I think there are very few cities throughout Europe and worldwide that could afford a 4-year research project like the one that we did in ClairCity. But I think that through carrying out the activity in 6 cities, we've learned so much that we think now. Well, we actually, of course, we have been thinking about how to continue this project, and yeah, we think that we can now do this whole method in a very limited time, say about 3 months' time, at very much reduced cost. And actually, where we are right now with the project, I think is that we are in a scaling up phase. That we would like to apply the method in a very fast way, as a kind of quick scan approach to a couple of more cities to kind of perfection the whole method and see what are the actual implementation possibilities in a very short time and at a very much reduced costs. And what it's going to cost exactly, I cannot say, but that also depends on the dialogue with that city or with those cities that would be interested. But what we're now interested in is some more cities that are so interested in the project that they want to continue with us, and see what the project, what the method can deliver for them.
Thank you, Stephan. And then I've got a group of questions that I will direct to Andy. That is all about the ambition level. If we see that citizens' appetite is there, but a little bit higher than the policymakers, how do we get then the politicians to be more ambitious? And then there is a similar question: are the policymakers becoming more ambitious in climate at the moment because of all the current activities we see, Greta Thunberg, IPCC report? Do we see that there is more appetite for being ambitious in policymakers? So the level of ambition between citizens and the policymaker. Andy, over to you.
I think that's always a difficult one, isn't it? I think what this has done is provided that sort of evidence and sort of an interesting way of engaging people, which is maybe more wider reaching than some other consultation exercises that may happen. So I think we've got this evidence, and I think we've got today in Bristol we've got people on the roof of City Hall, Extinction Rebellion, refusing to come down until Bristol City Council makes some commitments on clean air zone and commitments to a date of achieving compliance. So I think what we've seen with the Bristol Transport Strategy is some ambitious visions there, and I think it just takes time for that to feed through to those policies as they are developed. So I think it's all part of a bigger picture, and hopefully help to things to move in the right direction more quickly. But yeah, there's many factors that are considered, I think, and then we saw in some other cities where the practicality. So sometimes the citizens have very ambitious levels of policies that they want, but there may be some real physical barriers in terms of maybe finance and resources and the mechanisms, the legal mechanisms and the control that a city council may have over those various factors that need to be influenced to implement those policies. Yeah, but Bristol's not alone there. I think we will see what happens over the next few months with that, but the plans are being continued to be developed.
Yes, that does cover the gist of the questions about the level of ambition that's not always easy to be met. But yeah, thank you for that, Andy.
Could I say something to that, Hans, as well, if I may?
Yep. Come in.
Very briefly only. Yeah, I think it's always the level of ambition. It's always a question. I mean, citizens can be very ambitious, as we've seen, and can pull policies into the direction that we'd like to see it. On the other hand, there's also the practical constraints that have to be taken into account. I mean, it's very often it's a cost issue. There are practical barriers. So that's I think what makes the ClairCity project unique. That it's not only about citizens expressing their views, but also about policymakers discussing what is possible and seeing what they can do. So I think that's what we really add to a lot of existing methods that we already have.
Thank you for that, Stephan. Indeed, I think that's what makes us unique. We're not just voicing the voice of the citizens. We're trying to bring it into a dialogue with policymakers so that we get something that is interesting for both sides. We are getting to the end of the Q&A. I have one more set of questions for Irati. Irati, there are questions on our social inclusion. How do we get a good representation from all kind of social layers in society, and how do we get the business voice into our system? Can you say something about that?
Yes. Can you hear me well?
All good.
Yes. Okay, great. I think the different types of methods that we used for engaging people and serve to include different kinds of people already, as Enda explained in the beginning. For social inclusion, more in particular, for instance, for more deprived communities, what we've seen in both Amsterdam and Bristol and in other cities is that, for instance, online methods of engaging those wouldn't work, and we had to go to the communities ourselves. So just go and try survey people at the streets and going to simply to other neighborhoods. So we did that. Yeah, I think, does that answer your question? I guess there was also a lot more on this at the engagement webinar, the first webinar we ran, which is online.
Thank you, Irati. Indeed, with all these kind of research, we have this hard to reach voices. Make sure that you have balanced representation from social minorities as well as business, as the different parts. We have tried to do that. You can find more in the online on the other webinars. It's never perfect, and I'm pretty sure that we were not perfect, but at least we've given it a good shot to try to be inclusive and get the voices from all kinds of different groups in our analysis. Having said that, we are coming to the end of our meeting and to the end of our presentations. Thank you all very much for listening, for bringing in the questions that were really enriching the presentations and the debate. That was very helpful. We are now, this was the third webinar. There will be more coming. So please sign in for the next webinar, where we will concentrate on even more on community activation and what we call the people side of all our work. And we will stay in touch with you through email, through our social media. So please keep on following us. I want to thank, as this is the last webinar that I'm chairing, and I want to thank everybody, all the people in the project, all the partners in the project, the cities, but also all the people who are doing all the crunching of the numbers. It has been a lot of work for 4 years, and I think that We have been very grateful for the support from the European Commission to be able to do this, and I hope that the results will translate to many other cities in Europe. And if you are from another city, please reach out to us. We're happy to see how we can support you in your city with this approach as well. The ClairCity is a project that is, as you can see in your screen, with 10 research partners and 6 cities, and we could only do it with everybody together. And I'm proud to have been the project director for ClairCity. We are coming in our last months, and it's going to change when we don't have ClairCity anymore. So we really hope we can continue as much as possible to work with you in the cities in Europe on air quality and climate. Thank you very much, everybody, and I hope to see you soon in another setting, and I hope that will be live again, and so that we can see each other and not only through the computer screen. Thanks very much, and see you again. Bye-bye.